Snow has weight, my grandfather used to say, and eventually, it pushes back. I didn't understand what he meant until the morning I stepped outside at 5:12 a.m. and heard the low diesel growl of the HOA's plow scraping against asphalt like it owned the street. The air was sharp, maybe 12 degrees, the kind that burns your lungs on the first breath. I watched from my kitchen window as the truck angled its blade just a little too far to the right. Not an accident. Not a drift. A decision. The steel edge bit into the packed snow lining their road and sent a rolling white wall straight onto my property. It hit my fence with a dull, heavy thud. That was December. By January, the piles were 6 feet high. By February, they were closer to 8, packed dense from refreezing overnight, layered like concrete. Every storm followed the same pattern. The cul-de-sac behind me stayed clean, blacktop exposed and tidy. My side of the property looked like the North Pole storage yard. I lived just outside the HOA boundary line, intentionally. When I bought this strip of land 6 years ago, I paid extra to keep it independent. No dues. No board. No one measuring the height of my mailbox. Just me, a modest 1.3 acres, and a narrow access lane that connects their subdivision to the county road. Technically, that lane runs along the edge of my deeded property. Technically matters more than people think. The first time it happened, I let it go. Snow has to go somewhere, right? The second time, I noticed the angle of the blade. The third time, I installed a camera under the eave of my garage. The footage didn't lie. Each pass, the plow slowed as it reached my boundary marker. Each pass, it pivoted slightly, dumping the entire burden of Willow Creek Estates onto my land like I was their designated landfill. By mid-February, the weight started doing real damage. My cedar fence bowed inward, posts straining under the pressure. One panel cracked clean through with a sound like a splitting baseball bat. The small storage shed near the property line shifted off its blocks, door jammed shut by frozen runoff. When snow melts during the day and refreezes at night, it doesn't just sit there. It expands. It creeps. It pushes. I stood out there one evening, boots crunching over crusted ice, and ran my gloved hand along the warped fence rail. The wood felt brittle under the frost. Across the street, Maggie Whitmore's porch lights glowed warm and steady, her walkway perfectly cleared down to bare concrete. From her angle, the neighborhood looked pristine. From mine, it looked like calculated neglect. You can tell a lot about people by where they push their problems. Most winters, snow is just weather. That year, it was strategy, and I was done pretending it was an accident. By the time March rolled in, the piles had hardened into something that no longer looked like weather. They looked intentional. I drove a steel stake into the ground along my boundary line one afternoon, the metal ringing against frozen soil, and measured the drift with a tape. 8 feet, 4 inches at its highest point. The subdivision behind me, Willow Creek Estates, had clear pavement from curb to curb. Mailboxes stood upright. Decorative lampposts glowed over spotless driveways. Their plow company had done an impressive job, just not on my side. I pulled the property survey from my office cabinet that night, the one I had framed when I closed on the land. The parchment paper still smelled faintly of ink and dust. Lot lines marked in thick black strokes. The access lane that everyone in the subdivision used to exit toward the county road ran directly along my eastern boundary. That strip was mine. Not theirs. Not shared. Mine. I had bought it that way on purpose. I remembered the realtor asking if I was sure I did not want to join the association. I told her I preferred quiet ownership over committee meetings. Apparently, that made me the outlier. Over the winter, I had noticed the looks. Slow stares from drivers as they passed my driveway. A few neighbors walking their dogs would glance at the snow mounds and then back at my house as if I had invited it. Nobody ever knocked. Nobody ever asked if it was causing damage. Silence can be louder than confrontation. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the ice a pale orange, I stood at the edge of the lane and watched another plow pass. The blade dropped just before it reached my marker post. I saw the driver hesitate, then tilt the angle. Snow rolled in a clean arc. Onto my property again. Across the street, Maggie Whitmore stood on her porch in a wool coat the color of cream, arms folded, observing like a supervisor reviewing a job site. She gave a small nod when the pile landed squarely against my fence. It was subtle, but it was enough. I walked back inside, boots leaving wet prints across the tile, and replayed the camera footage on my monitor. Frame by frame, the pattern was obvious. The plow never distributed the load evenly. It redirected it. That is when I stopped seeing this as inconvenience and started seeing it as leverage. Snow melts. Paperwork does not. I opened my laptop and logged into the county records portal. Easement maps. Right-of-way agreements. Winter maintenance contracts. It took less than 30 minutes to confirm what I already suspected. The subdivision did not have a recorded winter use easement across my frontage. They were using the lane because it was convenient, not because it was granted. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the faint ticking of the baseboard heater. Outside, the piles pressed quietly against my fence, heavy and patient. Winter was almost over, and I had just realized something important. They were not just dumping snow on my land. They were relying on it. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in slow drips and long afternoons where the sun lingered just enough to soften the surface. The piles that had stood like white barricades began to sag, shrinking inch by inch, revealing layers of dirt and road grit trapped inside. I walked the perimeter one Saturday morning with a clipboard under my arm, boots sinking into slush that soaked through the leather. The smell of wet earth and thawing mulch filled the air. When snow melts, it tells the truth. Beneath the receding banks, the damage showed itself clearly. Fence posts tilted at awkward angles, nails pulled halfway out of warped boards. The lower siding of my shed was stained from weeks of trapped moisture. Runoff had carved shallow trenches along the base of my property where meltwater had nowhere else to go. I took photographs from every angle, careful to include my survey markers in each frame. Distance shots, close shots, tape measure extended to show depth. Documentation beats emotion every time. Across the lane, the subdivision looked almost cheerful. Lawns emerging in neat rectangles. Children riding bicycles in cautious circles on drying pavement. The access lane, now free of ice, revealed tire grooves cutting across its width from months of plow traffic pivoting at the same spot. That pivot point sat squarely on my deeded strip. I crouched and ran my fingers over the asphalt where the blade had scraped too low. The surface was scored in clean arcs, a physical signature of repeated use. Later that afternoon, I drove to the county office and requested certified copies of my plat map and the recorded easement index for Willow Creek Estates. The clerk slid the documents across the counter with a practiced smile. No winter maintenance easement. No shared access agreement beyond standard ingress and egress. Nothing granting them the right to stage equipment or deposit material on my land. The language was precise. Access did not equal control. Convenience did not equal permission. On my way home, I stopped at the hardware supply yard and priced modular steel traffic barriers rated for municipal use. Galvanized. Interlocking. Anchor ready. The manager explained weight tolerances and installation requirements in measured tones while forklifts hummed in the background. I nodded and took notes. If something is going to change behavior, it has to be physical and legal at the same time. That evening, as the last of the snow receded into shallow puddles, I stood at the edge of the lane and watched Maggie step out to collect her mail. She glanced at the exposed damage along my fence, then at me, then away. Not a word, not an apology, just the quiet assumption that winter was over and the inconvenience had passed. But winter had left evidence, and evidence has weight long after the ice is gone. I folded the county documents neatly and placed them on my desk beside the photographs. They had relied on the snow to hide the pattern. What they did not realize was that the melt had outlined it in black and white. The first warm rain came in April, steady and patient, tapping against my windows through the night. By morning, the runoff from the subdivision rolled down the access lane in thin silver streams, following the grooves carved by months of plow traffic before spilling onto my strip of land. I stood under the overhang of my garage with a mug of black coffee and watched the water pool along the edge where the snow piles had once stood. Without the frozen mass to hold it back, everything they had pushed onto me now dissolved into mud and debris, trickling through the grass like a quiet confession. Gravel, salt, sand, fragments of asphalt, it all settled into my soil. That is the thing about deferred problems. When they melt, they leave residue. I walked the lane again, this time with a small level and a measuring wheel. The surface where the plow had pivoted was slightly depressed, less than an inch, but enough to redirect water toward my property. Repetition creates patterns. Patterns create consequences. I could already see where grass would struggle to grow back. Across the street, Maggie stood with two board members near the mailbox cluster, clipboards in hand, discussing spring landscaping as if winter had been an ordinary season. Their voices carried faintly across the damp air. Words like maintenance budget and curb appeal floated toward me. Nobody mentioned the fence that had bowed under 8 feet of redirected snow. Nobody mentioned the shed door that still stuck when humidity rose. That silence was its own kind of statement. Later that afternoon, I requested a site visit from the county zoning office under the pretense of clarifying boundary improvements. The inspector arrived in a white pickup with the county seal on the door and a clipboard that looked older than the subdivision itself. He reviewed my plat map, walked the frontage, and nodded slowly when I pointed out the tire arcs and the absence of any recorded winter staging easement. His boots left damp prints beside mine as he examined the edge of the lane. He did not speculate. He simply confirmed what the documents already said. The frontage belonged to me. Any modification or obstruction within that boundary would be subject to my discretion as long as it complied with traffic visibility standards. That phrase stayed with me all evening. Subject to my discretion, not theirs. I sat at my kitchen table with the certified copy spread out under a warm lamp, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of lawn mowers starting up across the subdivision. Spring always makes people forget what winter did. They move on. They plant flowers. They repaint mailboxes. But land does not forget pressure. It records it in bent posts and eroded soil. I ran my thumb along the edge of the plat map and imagined the line in 3 dimensions, not just ink on paper, but steel and concrete set with intention. If they wanted to treat my property like overflow space, then it was time to remind them where overflow stops. Not with noise, not with anger, with something visible, something measured, something that would stand exactly where their convenience used to be. The permit application took less than an hour to complete, but I filled it out like it was a legal affidavit. Dimensions, setback distance, sightline clearance from the county road, material specifications. I requested approval for modular galvanized steel traffic barriers rated for municipal use, each 12 feet long, interlocking, anchored with removable concrete footings. Temporary structure, non-permanent, fully compliant with frontage ownership rights. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as she stamped the submission date in blue ink. 3 business days, she said. I nodded and thanked her. Patience is quieter than anger, but it carries further. While I waited, I replaced the damaged fence posts one by one. Post hole digger biting into damp soil. Fresh, treated lumber, sliding into place with a solid, reassuring weight. I worked slowly, deliberately, measuring twice before setting each level. Across the lane, the subdivision buzzed with early summer energy. Lawnmowers hummed. Delivery trucks rolled through without hesitation, tires crossing my frontage like it was public domain. I watched the traffic patterns carefully. Every vehicle exiting Willow Creek Estates relied on that narrow lane to angle toward the county road. It was their shortcut, their convenience, their assumed right. Maggie drove past one afternoon in her white sport utility vehicle, window cracked just enough for her voice to carry. Everything drying out over here, Ethan? She asked, tone light, almost playful. I leaned against my truck bed and wiped sawdust from my hands. It is getting there, I said. She glanced at the newly set fence posts, then at the exposed edge of the lane, then back at me. Good. We all just want things looking clean. The word clean hung in the air like perfume. She did not mention the months of redirected snow, did not mention the absence of any written agreement. From her perspective, winter had been weather. From mine, it had been documentation. On the 3rd business day, I received the approval notice by email. Authorized frontage improvement within property boundary subject to visibility requirements and non-obstruction of county roadway. I printed 2 copies and placed one in a clear plastic sleeve inside my truck. The other I set on my kitchen counter beside the plat map. That evening, I called the supply yard and confirmed delivery for the following week. 8 sections, 96 feet total, enough to span the frontage where the plows had pivoted all winter. Not blocking the county road, not impeding emergency access, just defining where my land began and where their convenience ended. As I hung up the phone, I stepped outside into the warm dusk. The sky was pale blue fading to amber, air thick with the scent of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. Children rode bicycles past the entrance sign of the subdivision, laughter echoing lightly across the pavement. They did not see boundaries. They saw open space. Adults, however, understand lines. Lines determine responsibility. Lines determine cost. I looked down the lane one more time, imagining steel resting exactly along that inked border on my plat map. Winter had shown me where they leaned. Spring had shown me the damage. Summer was going to show them the line. The delivery truck arrived just after 9 in the morning, brakes hissing as it eased onto the county shoulder. The driver stepped out, glanced at the paperwork I handed him, and nodded when he saw the permit number printed clearly across the top. 8 galvanized steel sections, each 12 feet long, stacked neatly on the flatbed like oversized dominoes. Even in the summer sun, the metal had a cold look to it, industrial and unapologetic. We unloaded them one by one with a small forklift, setting them carefully along the grass just inside my surveyed boundary line. The sound of steel touching pavement rang sharp and clean. Across the lane, curtains shifted. A garage door paused halfway open before lowering again. Word travels fast in subdivisions. By late morning, I had measured the frontage twice more, chalk lines snapping straight along the asphalt where my property met their access path. I marked anchor points every 12 feet, making sure the placement complied exactly with the visibility requirements the county inspector had outlined. No obstruction to the county roadway. No interference with emergency vehicles. Just a defined edge where there had been none before. When I set the first barrier upright, the weight settled with a low, satisfying thud. It stood waist-high, solid, impossible to ignore. One by one, the sections locked together, steel hooks sliding into place with a decisive click. 96 feet of boundary made visible. By the time I tightened the final anchor bolt, the access lane had transformed. What had once felt like an extension of the subdivision now looked clearly divided. Vehicles approaching from inside Willow Creek Estates slowed instinctively, drivers recalculating the turn radius they had taken for granted all winter. The wide arc they used to pivot plows and delivery trucks was gone. In its place stood a straight line. Maggie appeared just after noon, walking briskly across the asphalt in low-heeled sandals, sunglasses shielding her expression but not her posture. She stopped a few feet from the barrier, hands resting lightly on her hips. "What is this, Ethan?" she asked, her tone measured but tight around the edges. I wiped a trace of dust from my palms and handed her a copy of the permit and plat map. "Frontage improvement within my property boundary," I said calmly. "Fully compliant." Her eyes moved across the document, scanning the county seal, the dates, the stamped approval. "You cannot block access to the neighborhood," she said. "I did not block the county road," I replied. "The entrance remains open. This portion belongs to me." She looked past me at the line of steel stretching across the frontage where their plow had turned all winter. Cars began stacking lightly inside the subdivision, drivers waiting their turn to make a narrower exit. It was not chaos. It was adjustment. Convenience had been reduced to compliance. Maggie lowered the paper slightly, her jaw set firm. "We will have to review this with the board," she said. I nodded once. "That sounds appropriate." The afternoon sun glinted off the galvanized surface, bright enough to make you squint. For the first time since December, the boundary was no longer invisible. It did not shout. It did not argue. It simply stood there, exactly where the ink on my deed said it should. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at 7 o'clock sharp, inside the small clubhouse that sat just beyond the subdivision entrance. I did not receive an invitation, but I attended. Anyway, the air inside smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and burnt coffee, folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a long plastic table where Maggie and 4 board members sat with matching binders. When I walked in, conversations dipped by half a tone. Steel has a way of changing room temperature even when it is not physically present. Maggie opened the meeting with routine business, landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, budget forecasts. Then she cleared her throat and shifted her glasses down the bridge of her nose. "We need to address an unexpected obstruction at the east frontage," she said carefully. All eyes moved toward me. I remained seated, hands folded, documents resting neatly on my lap. One board member, a man with a golf tan and a tight jaw, leaned forward. "You cannot just install barriers and disrupt community access," he said. I placed the county permit on the table and slid it toward them. "It is not community frontage," I replied evenly. It is my frontage. Approved and documented. Maggie flipped through the pages, her fingernails tapping softly against the plastic cover. This access lane has been used by residents for years, she said. Access does not equal ownership, I answered. There is no recorded winter staging easement, no maintenance agreement, and no right to deposit materials or maneuver equipment on my land. The room grew quiet except for the hum of the overhead lights. Another board member spoke up, softer this time. What exactly are you asking for? That was the first honest question of the evening. I unfolded a second document and laid it flat. A proposed seasonal access agreement. Defined snow management boundaries. A usage fee reflecting commercial plow pivot rights and frontage wear. $12,000 annually, indexed for maintenance costs. Silence settled heavier than any snow pile had. Maggie looked up slowly. You are charging the association? I met her gaze without raising my voice. I am charging for the use of my property. If the lane is valuable enough to rely on all winter, then it is valuable enough to respect in writing. One of the board members exhaled sharply, but nobody argued the documents. They could not. The county seal carried more authority than opinion. Outside, headlights flashed through the clubhouse windows as cars exited carefully through the narrowed turn, drivers adjusting their steering where they once swung wide. Inside, the conversation shifted from protest to calculation. Budget adjustments. Legal review. Insurance implications. Convenience had turned into a line item. Maggie finally closed the binder in front of her and folded her hands. We will need to discuss this privately, she said. Of course, I replied. I stood, gathered my copies, and walked out into the warm night air. The barrier waited exactly where I had installed it, catching the glow of streetlights like a quiet reminder. For months they had leaned their weight onto my side without asking. Now the weight had shifted back, measured in ink and steel. Not loud, not dramatic, just defined. The email arrived 3 days after the meeting, time-stamped at 6:42 a.m., subject line formal and stripped of attitude. Willow Creek Estates Board Resolution Proposal. I read it once at my kitchen counter while the coffee machine hissed, then again more slowly at my desk with the plat map spread beside it. They wanted a temporary removal of the barriers during winter months in exchange for a formalized seasonal access agreement. $12,000 annually had become $8,000 in their counteroffer, with language about shared community benefit woven carefully between the lines. I could almost hear Maggie's voice in the phrasing, polished and measured. I did not respond immediately. I drove down to the frontage instead and stood beside the steel, running my palm across the cool galvanized surface. Traffic had already adjusted over the past week. Delivery vans entered slower. Residents paused before turning. The lane felt different now, not hostile, just intentional. Later that afternoon, a landscaping truck attempted the old wide arc and had to correct sharply, tires edging close to the curb. No damage, just recalibration. Convenience was no longer automatic. That evening, 2 board members knocked on my door. Not Maggie. These 2 looked less certain than they had in the clubhouse, clipboards replaced with folded hands. We have reviewed the insurance implications, one of them said. Without a written agreement, liability exposure increases for both parties. The other added, the plow contractor confirmed they have been using your frontage for turnaround because it is the widest point. I let the silence stretch a few seconds before answering. Then you understand the value of what you have been using. They exchanged a glance. We can approve the $8,000 with a 3-year term, indexed for inflation, the first one said. Carefully. Define snow deposit boundaries. No material storage on your land. Written notice before any modification. It was close to what I had drafted. Not identical, but close. I told them I would review the language once more with a property attorney I trust. That part was true. Paperwork is only as strong as its weakest clause. Over the next 48 hours, revisions passed back and forth by email. Small adjustments. Clarified pivot radius limits. A diagram showing exactly where snow could be placed without contacting my fence. The final draft arrived on a quiet Sunday morning. I printed 2 copies and set them on my dining table, smoothing each page flat. Outside, summer sunlight filtered through the trees lining the lane, casting long shadows against the steel barrier. It stood as proof of what had changed. Not the weather, not the neighborhood, the line. When Maggie came by that afternoon, she did not bring sunglasses. She brought a pen. Her expression was controlled, but the edge had softened. "We want this resolved before winter," she said. "So do I," I replied. We signed at the same table where I had first spread out the county maps months earlier. $8,000 per year. 3-year term. Defined use. Defined limits. Defined responsibility. The first payment due before the first forecasted snowfall. As she stepped back outside, she paused beside the barrier and looked down its length. It no longer represented obstruction. It represented agreement. Steel had done what conversation alone could not. It had turned assumption into ink. The first snowfall of the new season arrived in early December, soft and steady, covering the lane in a clean white layer that erased tire marks and summer dust in a single night. I woke before sunrise out of habit and stepped outside with a cup of coffee, the air sharp and familiar against my face. The steel barriers had been removed the week before under the terms of the agreement, stacked neatly along my fence line, visible but inactive. In their place, bright orange boundary markers now lined the exact pivot radius approved in writing. Small stakes, reflective, impossible to miss. By 7 o'clock, the plow truck rolled in from the subdivision entrance, diesel engine humming low and controlled. I stood near the edge of my property and watched carefully. The driver slowed as he approached the frontage. Blade angled cautiously. Instead of swinging wide across my land, he followed the diagram attached to the contract, turning precisely within the defined arc. Snow rolled forward, not sideways. What did land on my strip stayed within the marked boundary, no higher than the agreed limit. It was not dramatic. It was disciplined. Across the street, Maggie stood at the mailbox cluster in a wool coat, observing the same maneuver I was. For a brief second, our eyes met. No nod this time. No performance. Just acknowledgement. The difference between assumption and agreement is measurable. That winter, the piles never rose above 4 feet. My fence remained straight. The shed door opened smoothly even after heavy storms. When temperatures climbed and the melt began, runoff followed the channels we had defined, not the ones carved by neglect. In late January, the association treasurer mailed the first installment of the annual payment exactly on schedule. $8,000, certified check, memo line reading seasonal frontage access. I deposited it without ceremony. Money was not the point. Respect was. One evening in February, I walked the lane after a light dusting, boots pressing quiet prints into fresh snow. The neighborhood looked almost peaceful under the streetlights, rooftops outlined in white, lawns smooth and untouched. It struck me how easily this entire conflict could have been avoided with a single conversation months earlier. But convenience is loud. Ownership is quiet. Steel had taught that lesson more effectively than any argument could. By March, when the final storm passed and sunlight began stretching longer across the pavement, the barriers returned to their summer position along my boundary. Not as a threat, not as punishment, just as a reminder. The ink on the agreement remained clear. The line on the plat map remained straight. And when the last of the snow melted into the soil without bending a single post, I understood what my grandfather had meant all those years ago. Snow has weight. So does a deed. The difference is that one melts. The other endures.